Good evening, everyone. Welcome to A City Divided, Police-Citizen Violence, Police Reform, presented by the Episcopal Diocese of Pittsburgh, Social Justice and Outreach Committee, and Commission on Race and Reconciliation. I'm Frances Dannenberg, a member of the Commission on Race and Reconciliation. The number of co-sponsoring organizations who've agreed to join us this evening shows the importance people are giving to this topic and why so many of us have gathered this evening. They are the JCC Center for Loving Kindness, Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania, St. Brendan's Justice Ministry, St. James Episcopal Church, Penn Hills, St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, Highland Park, St. Paul's Episcopal Church, Mount Lebanon, Episcopal Church of the Redeemer, Squirrel Hill, Community of Celebration, Aliquippa, Congregation Dor Hadash, and East Liberty Presbyterian Church. So that everyone knows how we'll meet on our virtual platform this evening, here are the guidelines. Everyone is muted and needs to remain muted. Our speakers welcome questions, however, so please enter them into the chat box at any time this evening. We'll have a question and answer period, and we'll take questions from the chat to give to the speakers. I want to let you know we are recording. If you prefer to remain anonymous, use the rename function to change the name on your picture. I would like to invite the Reverend Liddy Barlow, Executive Minister of the Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania, to give our opening prayer. Reverend Barlow.
Thank you, Frances. Friends, will you please join me in the spirit of prayer? Faithful and holy God, on nearly every page of your scriptures, we hear the call for justice. The law in Deuteronomy calls out, "Justice, justice, you shall pursue." The prophet Micah reminds us three things are needful: doing justice and loving kindness and walking humbly with God. In the Christian scriptures, Jesus preaches, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be filled." And yet, our attempts to pursue this high calling have too often resulted in its clear opposite. Our so-called justice system enmeshes the innocent, discriminates against our neighbors, and condemns your children to fear, mistrust, and diminished life. On the streets of our own city, within our neighborhoods, in our living memory, and up to this present day, justice has too often been denied. Disrupt our complacency, Lord. Help us to see the systems that may work for some are deeply broken for others. Grant us, God, the clarity of mind and the strength of purpose to heed your call. With your guiding spirit, help us to untangle what is broken, to be allies across our diverse community, so that we may pursue the justice to which you call us. Bless our time together this evening, O God. May it lead to our deepened understanding, and may it set a fire within us that cannot be quenched until your justice rolls down like waters and your righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. We make this prayer in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Barlow. We are fortunate to have with us this evening Professor David Harris and the Reverend Dr. John Welch. And the evening will consist of a talk by Professor Harris, followed by a response by the Reverend Dr. Welch. Let me tell you who our distinguished speakers are. David A. Harris is the Semenko Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh's Law School, where he teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence, and other courses. David devotes his research and writing to the study of police conduct, search and seizure law, and the intersection of race and criminal justice. He's the leading national authority on racial profiling. His 2002 book, Profiles in Injustice, and his many scholarly articles on the topic resulted in new laws and regulations in hundreds of American police departments. He is also the creator and host of the Criminal Injustice podcast, devoted since 2016 to interviews with justice system actors, advocates, journalists, and many others, and news analysis and commentary on the most difficult problems in the criminal system. In Pittsburgh and in other communities around the country, he's applied his work to creating better relationships between police and the communities they serve, particularly African American communities, to bring about both respectful, just policing and public safety. This work resulted in David receiving the Jefferson Award for Public Service in 2015. David is now serving on the Mayor's Community Task Force on Police Reform, appointed last month. Today, David will speak to us about his latest book, A City Divided: Race, Fear, and the Law in Police Confrontations, published by Anthem Press, available on Amazon, local independent bookstores like the White Whale Books in Bloomfield, and everywhere else. It tells the story of one terrible incident of police-civilian violence here in Pittsburgh, and the case's full journey through the legal system. But the book doesn't stop there. It tells us not just what happened, but why, and why these incidents of violence between police and civilians, particularly Black Americans, keep happening all over the country. And today, that subject could not be more timely. Let me tell you about the Reverend Dr. John C. Welch, who will be speaking after Dr. Harris, Professor Harris. Reverend Dr. John C. Welch is a professor, a pastor, and a social justice worker with an enviably broad background. He has worked as an engineer, Dean of Students and Vice President for Student Service and Community Engagement at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, served on numerous boards, advisory committees, and commissions, and for 10 years was the chief chaplain for the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police. In terms of his education, he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering and Economics from Carnegie Mellon University, a Master's of Divinity degree from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and a PhD from Duquesne University in Healthcare Ethics. He is currently an adjunct professor of business ethics at the University of Pittsburgh Katz Graduate School of Business and the University of Pittsburgh's Consortium Ethics Program. He also sits on the ethics committees for both UPMC Passavant and Forbes Hospital of Allegheny Health Network. Dr. Welch was a Democratic candidate for mayor of the city of Pittsburgh, pushing the narrative to address lead toxicity in the city's water supply and vacant lots, as well as the inequity in housing and community development. Dr. Welch is married to the Reverend Dr. B. Denise Welch. Before we turn the floor over to Professor Harris, let me remind anyone who's just joined that although you are muted, Professor Harris and Dr. Welch earnestly would like to receive your questions, so please put them into the chat. I now gratefully turn the floor over to Professor Harris. Professor Harris.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening. There were two stories that came from one incident on a night in January of 2010 in the Homewood neighborhood. One incident, but very much two different stories. And I want to begin by telling you both of those stories. This is the police story. On January 12th of 2010, 3 plainclothes anti-crime police officers in an unmarked car were patrolling a neighborhood called Homewood here in Pittsburgh. There were David Sisak, Richard Ewing, and Michael Saldute, and they had been specially selected to be in this car to look for guns and drugs because Homewood had a lot of violence and drug trafficking. They were looking for those things and rolling down Tioga Street in Homewood when one of the officers said that he thought he saw a male figure pressing himself up against one of the small houses. They drove to the end of the block, circled around, and came back to and when they were just about even with the spot where the one officer said he saw the man, a male figure came out and walked toward the street. The police officers stopped their vehicle. One of them, who was closest to the man, opened his door, got out, stood up, showed his badge, said, "Pittsburgh Police, can you hold it there?" The man stopped. The police officer began to ask the man some questions, but right away, not just the first officer, but the other 2 who could see this happening, they detected something very dangerous. They said immediately they knew this man had a gun. It was in the way he stood. It was in the way he held his coat pocket, and that pocket was kind of sagging down. They could tell. They just knew. And after answering a couple of their questions, the man just started to run. Now, he didn't get more than a few steps before he fell just face forward because the ground was covered with ice and snow. And immediately, the 3 police officers were out of that car, all yelling, "Pittsburgh Police, stay down, Pittsburgh Police." The man tried to push himself up off the ground, and so they jumped on him as quickly as they could, and the man started to fight them. Even though he was kind of pinned to the ground, he fought them and fought them really hard. This became a real struggle very, very fast. And when one of the officers had the man's right hand, they were going to put a cuff on the man's right hand. Somehow his hand got away, and the hand moved directly towards that right hand coat pocket where they'd seen the bulge of the gun. And the officer called out to his crew, "The gun, he's going for it. He's going for the gun." And in that moment, all 3 of those officers, they knew they were in deadly danger. Somebody was about to get shot. He was going to try to kill them. And so the officer who was closest to the man's head began to rain blows on the man's head as heavy as he could. And eventually, the man stopped struggling and he went limp. They put cuffs on him. They sat him up. And of course, they went immediately for that right coat pocket and pulled out a bottle of Mountain Dew soda, which they tossed away. Not a gun. They looked all over for a gun. Didn't find one. Not a gun. Mountain Dew soda. They called a police wagon to take the man first to the hospital because he seemed to be hurt, and then to jail. 2 of them had been hit pretty bad in the fight, one of them injured, and so they charged this young man with 2 counts of aggravated assault, felony assault on 2 police officers, and a host of other crimes. That's the police story of that night. This is Jordan's story. Jordan Miles, advance the slide here. Jordan Miles, 18 years old, turned 18 years old the day before. He lived on Tioga Street. And at 11 p.m. on January 12th, he was about to do what he did every single night. He was about to leave his house where his mother and he and his siblings all lived. He was going to walk around the block to his grandmother's house. She lived on Susquehanna. And he did this because the small house in which the family lived was small. And his grandmother had extra room. And since the 7th grade, Jordan had his bedroom at his grandmother's house. So there was nothing unusual in what he did as he walked out of his house. as soon as he got out of his house, he hadn't gone but a few steps down the block when he began to see, he was walking in the street because there's so much ice on the sidewalk. There was a dark car down the block, and it came rapidly at him and stopped so close he kind of had to jump back into the grass, into where the grass would have been on the ice. And 3 very large men came out of that car full speed in regular clothes and started to yell at him, yelling, "Where's the gun? Where's your drugs? Where's the money? Where's the gun?" And Jordan had no idea who these people were, but he knew something very bad was happening to him. He figured he was about to be robbed. I mean, he was in Homewood. He knew that there was crime in Homewood, and he figured these people wanted his money. He knew he didn't have a gun or drugs, and so he tried to run. And he only got 3 or 4 steps before he fell face down into the ice and the snow. And as he tried to push himself up, get his face out of the snow, the men were all over him, these 3 very big men, and they started beating him and beating him. And Jordan had a problem. He couldn't breathe. His face was down in the snow and ice. He could not breathe. And he tried to push himself up so he could get some breath into his lungs. And every time he did that, they hit him and hit him and hit him harder. And finally, a huge series of crushing blows on his head. And he just figured, I'm going to die here, right outside my mother's house. I'm about to be killed. And he just gave up. He just put his face down and gave up. And when he did that, the men stopped hitting him. It was a minute or so later that he noticed another vehicle pulling up. He turned his head finally, and it was a police wagon. He thought the neighbors had called the police, had seen what was happening to him. But the 2 men in uniform who got out of the truck immediately started talking to the other 3 men. That was the first that he knew that these 3 other men were police officers. They took him, put him in handcuffs, took him down to the hospital, and then to jail. That's what happened that night to Jordan Miles. Now, 1 incident, 2 stories. I'm confident that anybody who reads this book is going to be able to decide what they think happened, because there are some very critical differences. Much about these 2 stories is the same. The fight in the snow and the ice, the running, everything. But it's that announcing that they were police that's quite different, right? Jordan said he had no idea. They said he couldn't have mistaken it. They said he had a gun. In fact, to this day, to the end of all the legal proceedings in the case, the officers continue to believe Jordan had a gun. He said not only did he never have a gun, he doesn't drink Mountain Dew. Never has. Didn't have any. You'll figure it out. I've laid all the facts out, but there is something that is more important. The most important thing I want to say is that Jordan lived, right? Because not everybody who goes through an experience like this does live. We know that, don't we? And Jordan lived, and his voice is very much a part of this story through and through the book. He's there. He got to tell his own story. Now, beyond that, to me, the most important thing is to understand why this happened. Why did it happen? It's one thing to conclude what happened, but why did it happen? And why does it keep happening every single day and night in cities and towns across America? When a person, a civilian, often, too often, disproportionately often, a young black man crosses paths with police, why is this the outcome? And sometimes worse. If we can figure out why this happened, maybe we can stop it from happening. That's really what the book is about. So let me tell you just a little bit more of the story, and then we'll go to that core question of why. As I said, Jordan was arrested. He was taken first to the hospital and then to jail. He was drug tested at the hospital. He was negative. And then he was taken to jail. And it was late the next day, January 13th, that his mother and grandmother came down, were able to finally bail him out. And they took him to the hospital again before taking him home. And Jordan faced some fairly serious charges, 2 aggravated felonies and a host of other misdemeanors. He was going to have to, his life was changed in many ways. But chances are, honestly, we would not have known anything about this incident. We would not know Jordan Miles' name. We wouldn't be talking about this, much less would there be a book about it. But about 10 or 12 days after this incident, these photographs and some others hit the media. Now, these are just 2 of them. There are others, and some are worse. Remember that this is 2010, so it wasn't like photographs would ricochet around the world like viral videos in 5 minutes or an hour. But these were in every television news story. They were on in both of our daily papers. They were everywhere. And people were outraged. How could this happen? How does a 5'6", 150-pound kid who goes to the Kappa High School where he plays the viola in the orchestra, where he is on the honor roll, and has never had a breath of problems with the police, how does he end up under a pile of 6 foot, 200-pound, well-trained Pittsburgh police officers and come out looking like this? And the outrage in the city, I must tell you, was palpable, and it went top to bottom, the mayor, chief of police, and all the way down. These are students from the Kappa High School who marched across the downtown from their downtown campus to the city county building right after all of this became public, protesting what had happened to Jordan. How could this happen? We couldn't allow this to happen. What could it possibly account for this? People wanted justice, and they were angry. They were upset. They were outraged. We heard it from the mayor and the police chief, like I said. And the kids were not alone. Other demonstrations began to take place. Here is one of them. And they went on and did not let up. Here's another one and another one. And you might have thought that Pittsburgh had determined at this point it was going to get some answers, because people were not going to stand for this sort of thing on some kind of ongoing basis, that they had had enough and people were not going to accept this. But there was more to it. It turned out that there was an undercurrent of outrage in the other direction, and it took almost 2 months to show up. The first legal proceeding in any criminal case is usually something called a preliminary hearing for felonies in Pittsburgh. And a preliminary hearing is usually a very straightforward and simple thing. No jury, it's only a judge. The job is not to figure out whether a person is guilty or not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It is only for the purpose of determining whether there is probable cause, just enough evidence to go on and have a trial. Right? These things, I got to say, are usually a slam dunk for the prosecution. Usually no problem at all. They have 1 police officer, maybe 2, depending on the case, come in and testify. The judge hears them. There's no defense evidence, nothing like this. And the judge says, probable cause, next case. So Jordan's preliminary hearing took place in the early part of March of 2010. And Jordan, of course, was there, but it was, it's pretty one-sided. That's how preliminary hearings work. One of the three police officers testified. He testified exactly the way that the police report was written. No problem there. He was straightforward. He was professional. There was a civilian witness brought in by the defense, which was pretty unusual. But if that was not the most unusual thing that happened, because at the end of the hearing, the judge threw the case out. Now, I cannot express to you just how unusual that is. And there is no way to read the transcript in that preliminary hearing, and I have read it multiple times. You cannot mistake what the judge was saying. He didn't believe the police officers. He didn't buy their story. He just didn't. He knew that if the DA wanted to refile the charges, he could, but he said, look, what you've given me, I'm not convinced, and threw the case out. And that sparked the public outrage in the other direction. I said there was a different current of outrage. Well, now it became visible. And it really showed it. I mean, you began to hear it on radio talk shows, places on television, in the newspapers, and it really showed itself in one of our yearly civic events, the St. Patrick's Day Parade of that year. And every year, lots of organizations participate. The police and the Fraternal Order of Police always participate. Well, they chose the St. Patrick's Day Parade to make a statement. Now, up to this point, the FOP and other law enforcement organizations were saying, don't rush to judgment. The facts aren't out. You'll see. Don't condemn these police officers. Well, it turned out that they were ready to come to judgment themselves. This is the St. Patrick's Day Parade, and this is the group of police officers who marched in it. Now, it's a little hard to read this. I know. I've got a close-up of the back of this shirt. They marched in numbers, all wearing this shirt. We support our three brothers. So if they had had any doubt about coming to any kind of a judgment about this, clearly that had been abandoned. You see our three brothers with the thin blue line running directly through three and brothers. I don't have an image of the other side of the shirt, but it gave four numbers, 3599, which was the radio call sign for that very unmarked car on that very night. So it's very clear what they were saying. We know where our loyalty lies. We don't need anybody to tell us what happened. And the outrage was now open and in a cycle that was basically never ending. People, many people, but particularly folks in the African American community, were very, very disappointed and angry and outraged that they had chosen a civic parade marching as a group to put this out there, to put this message out there. So now you had outrage upon outrage upon outrage. What followed this? There were three different investigations that had ramped up and were going full steam by the time spring of 2010 came along. There was an internal investigation by what's called the Office of Municipal Investigations, that's OMI. They investigate wrongdoing by people in every municipal agency in the city government. There was a state investigation led by our district attorney, Stephen Zappala. When I say state, I mean local, but using state law. And then there was a federal investigation led by the United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania. All right, so let me just touch on those three things very briefly and then go to our central set of questions. The U.S. Attorney for the Western District represents the Department of Justice here in Western Pennsylvania. They covered not only Allegheny County, but 6 Western Pennsylvania counties. If there is a federal crime, it is up to this office to investigate it and prosecute it. So they investigated the three officers for possible federal wrongdoing in what they did to Jordan Miles. But in the end, they were hampered by a law that's very, very old that they had to operate under. It's this. It's the first bullet on your screen there. It says, whoever under color of any law willfully subjects any inhabitant to the deprivation of rights, privileges, or immunities. And that word willfully is key. The Supreme Court interpreted it in this case in 1945 called Screws to mean that willful means that they had a purpose to deprive a person of a specific constitutional right. It's not enough to be doing wrong. You had to do wrong with the purpose of depriving somebody of their particular constitutional right. This is the highest standard in American criminal law. And the U.S. attorney eventually concluded after 3 different investigations that he could not prosecute the officers under this federal law. And so he came out and announced on May 4th of 2011, almost 18 months after the incident, that he was not able to prosecute. He said, I don't think people did the right thing here. Don't take this as my saying I approve of what happened out on that street that night, but I cannot prove a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. What happened after that was the next day, there is our then police chief, Nathan Harper, standing to his left and a little back, our boy mayor, Luke Ravenstall. Chief Harper, there he is, announcing he was reinstating the 3 officers. They had been on administrative paid leave since the incident, and he was putting them back on the street. He basically blamed the whole thing on Jordan, said if Jordan hadn't run, if he had just answered questions, we wouldn't be here. Right? We're not the enemy out there, said Chief Harper. And then he let slip something that nobody had known about before. Oh, that internal investigation? It's not going to even result in any discipline, let alone any criminal charges. There was still one investigation hanging out there, right? Yes, the one by Mr. Zappala. Well, he waits a year till May of 2012 and announces he's not going to bring any charges against the officers. So what do we have? We're left with charges dropped against Jordan, no federal charges against the police, no state charges against the police, and not even any discipline. So if there was going to be any kind of accounting or accountability for this, it would have to come elsewhere. And it would. It would come in a civil trial, in a civil case that Jordan filed in federal court against the city, the police department, and the 3 officers. So let's take a step back from this story and let's ask that central question. Why does this keep happening? And there are many reasons. There's a lot you could say. All of it's in the book. But I want to focus us on one thing in particular first and then another, because there are 2 main reasons that this happened and keeps happening over and over and over. And those 2 reasons are race and fear. These are the twin poisons that we have to fight against if we are going to overcome this. Let me talk first about race, and then I'll turn to fear. We've known in the scientific literature for decades and decades, well established that the dominant stereotypes in American society of blacks, but particularly black men, are that they are criminal, they are dangerous, they are violent. They are to be avoided for those reasons. And this is a direct product of the aftermath of slavery and white supremacy. It was a way to justify keeping black people controlled. But what we have learned in the last 2 decades, 20, 25 years from social psychologists is newer, much deeper, and much better informed than just here's the stereotype. And I want to tell you about 2 of the pieces of work that I think really stand out to explain how race works in our society, particularly with regard to crime. Here's the first of these things I want to tell you about. First study. This was done by Jennifer Eberhard. Jennifer Eberhard is a professor at Stanford, Stanford, excuse me. She is a MacArthur Genius Award winner, and one of the nicest people you will ever meet on top of it. Her team, which included Philip Atiba Goff, then her young protege and now a force of his own, and some other folks, they did this landmark study called Seeing Black, Race, Crime, and Visual Processing. And what they found over a series of brilliant experiments that they published together in this article was that seeing a Black person actually served as a tuning device on the brain and the visual system. And seeing weapons actually tuned people's eyes and brains to images of Black people in crowds. Let me just tell you a little bit about how these experiments worked, just a couple of them. They use a very well-known technique called priming, right? They have an experimental subject who is going to look at some things and react to them, and they prime the subject by showing very rapidly just kind of a flash of a picture. Some of the experimental subjects, some of these people were shown faces of Black people. Some were shown faces of white people. And some were shown no faces at all in the initial experiment. All right, so you got it? The primes are Black face, white face, no face. And then they were asked to look at a series of images, 41 in all. These are called degraded visual images. It resembles the snow on the TV, the old TV sets. Like remember when you were between channels? You remember that, older folks? Me, right? And hidden way, way down in the snow in this degraded visual image is the outlines of an object, right? Sometimes the object is a weapon. Sometimes the object is something else. When the experimental subjects are shown the prime of the Black face versus a white face or no face at all, they much more quickly in the series of slides pick out the weapon. Let me show you what I mean by this series of slides. There we go. Where's our cursor? Sorry about that. I know that they were better at this than I was. All right, so frame 1 is all the way over on your left. You can barely see down in the snow. There's something in there. And then if you got all the way to frame 41, it's clearly a picture of a gun. The people who saw the Black face flash across the screen first, they're able to pick out a gun from these degraded images much earlier in the series than people who saw a white face or people who saw no face. There was a distinct and clear difference. Seeing the Black face attuned them to picking out a weapon, right? Kind of the reverse in one of the other experiments in the studies, they would show people primes, but the primes were pictures of objects. Some of the objects were weapons. Some were just household implements, you know, a broom, a brush, whatever. People who saw and then the experimental subjects would be shown a photo of a crowd of people, a group of people. The experimental subjects who saw the weapons, as opposed to the other objects, their eyes went directly to the Black faces in the photograph. So Eberhardt and her team conclude Blackness is a visual tuning device for the American brain and visual system, and the association with weapons could not be clearer. Here's another one I'll show you just quickly. The essence of innocence. Consequences of dehumanizing Black children, right? And you see this one, this is 10 years later, now Philip Atiba Goff, who is, by the way, a professor to be at Yale, switching from another school. He'll be going there. And he is the head of the Center for Policing Equity, a real force in this whole area. The essence of innocence, consequences of dehumanizing Black children. What they found over a series of experiments is that when people view photographs of Black children versus white children, they constantly and consistently overestimate in Black children their size, their age, their muscularity, and the degree of threat that they might pose. as opposed to looking at images of white children. And the difference, as I said, is measurable. Here's an example. Do you know who this is? You may recognize this boy. His name is Tame Rice. He was killed by police officers in Cleveland. He was on a playground and playing with a toy gun. Some neighbor called up and said, I think there's a person with a gun over in the park across the street, but it could be a toy. Now, that last part never made it past the dispatcher. The dispatcher sent the police, and the police pulled up in their car. Instead of taking a safe position, they pulled up right next to Tame, and within 3 seconds, they had shot him dead. 3 seconds. What emerged after this, when we look at the report of the police officer, was this. This is from a Washington Post article. Officer Lohman, who killed Tame, said that he, quote, appeared to be over 18 years old and 185 pounds, on both 50% wrong. Prosecutors even pick this up weeks later, well after everybody knows just exactly how big and how old Tame is. And they go right back to this as a kind of trope in their own documents. Tame was big for his age, with a men's XL jacket and size 36 pants, and could easily have passed for someone much older. Well, you saw his photo, you tell me. This is the kind of effect that race has. People don't even know it's having it, and there it is. What about fear, the other twin poison, the other twin toxin? Well, it may surprise you that I'll take this approach, but I want to say that fear is a big factor in what happens in these incidents, and it's a factor not just for the people in front of police, particularly people of color. It's a factor for police officers too. And again, that might surprise you, right? Am I saying that police officers are not brave and courageous? Absolutely not. They are brave and courageous. They definitely are. Remember what former President Obama would like to say about police. He would say that police are the ones who run toward the danger when the rest of us are running away. I don't take that away from them for a minute, right? But just the fact that they are brave does not mean that there is no fear. Bravery and courage does not mean an absence of fear. What you need is some way to deal with your fear, right? And the sad thing I have to report to you is that in today's police training and police culture, fear is amped up all over the place. Officers are told from the academy forward to be fearful, and that doesn't help anybody or anything. Let me show you something. This is a cover of a book. It's called On Combat. The author is Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He has a co-author. And the subtitle, which you might be able to read, is The Psychology and Physiology of Deadly Conflict in War and Peace. And that's very, very telling. Lieutenant Colonel Grossman's work has become kind of the industry standard. He does a lot of private police teaching. Did you know that there's an industry of private police training? It's generally officers who are either sent by their own departments or pay their own way, who are already out in the field and they want to get better at their job, so they do private trainings in addition to their own kind of continuing education and retraining they have to do. And Lieutenant Colonel Grossman's mantra is the warrior police officer, the warrior police officer. And what he means by this comes in the following form. Every encounter with a civilian is potentially deadly, not just a very, very few of them, as is actually the case. That's what the data shows us. Not just even some of them, but every encounter, the police officer may be killed and must act as if that is a real possibility in every encounter with the civilian world. His famous use of the sheep and the sheepdog metaphor. He loves this, Grossman does. Most people are just sheep, grazing and eating the grass, wanting nothing but to be left alone. But the deadly wolves are everywhere, lurking everywhere, trying to find the opportunity to rip out the sheep's throats and kill them. And the police, they are, of course, the sheepdogs, right? And so the function of police in this violent world is to always be ready to use righteous violence to defend the rest of us. Righteous violence. That's what you turn to. That's how you conquer your fear, right? So if you're a warrior, that's how it looks. The world is a very dangerous place. It's a war out there. And so I came across this a couple of months ago. This was from an interview I heard on the radio. That's exactly what police training does. This man is an ex-CIA and a police officer currently in Savannah, Georgia. Every situation is not just can be dangerous, but it will be dangerous because we're in a war on crime. And anybody can kill you. He wrote an essay piece just a day or so later in one of the newspapers in the country. The well-documented militarization of American police departments has inevitably produced officers who see themselves in their roles as warriors or punishers or sheepdogs. What our society finds so distressing in police interactions, disrespect, anger, frustration, and violence, is not a result of flawed training. It is a result of training for war. It's working like it's supposed to, in other words. This is what we have going on in police training and culture now. But this is not all of it. The police are actually getting their fear amped up in another way, too. This is an image from a very, very frequently used video, right? Police are shown from the recruit period onward. Videos, generally from a dash cam point of view. That's what this is. This is a dash cam video of a deputy named Kyle Dinkheller being murdered by a man with a rifle who he stopped for a traffic offense. And there is a sort of canon, C-A-N-O-N, a sort of group of these videos that is shown in police trainings, recruit trainings, in Lieutenant Colonel Grossman's trainings, all over the country. A lot of this stuff is up on YouTube. You can see it too. And the message being put out is clear. This is what the world is. Now, you could envision a role for this, right? Because you could say, look, don't make the mistakes, the tactical errors that this officer did, but they're not really shown for that purpose. They are shown to show police officers, especially recruits, what they should expect, that anybody, anytime, could murder them. And then we cannot discount this. This country is full of guns, right? Guns are everywhere. And that is not something that police officers in other countries have to think about, honestly. And we cannot wish this away. We cannot say that this is a cultural thing that police just have to start doing something about in terms of their attitude. Guns are out there, and they know it. And so they have to be thinking about this all the time. All right? So if those are some of the sources of fear on the police side, what about on the civilian side? And particularly, most importantly, on the part of Black Americans and other people of color. This is Nicole Hannah-Jones. She is now a MacArthur winner herself, and I believe a Pulitzer winner for the 1619 Project, which she, I think, spearheaded. And I did a lot of reading in the course of researching this book, but one of her essays is one that always has stayed with me through all of this. And I just share this little piece of it with you. She's addressing her white readers in this particular essay where she's talking about what kind of expectations Black Americans might have for the justice system and police. And she says, quote, "It's possible this will come as a surprise to you, but to a very real extent, you have grown up in a different country than I have. A different country vis-a-vis the full justice system and particularly policing." If you want to know just how different a country, think back, if you're a white person listening to me, think back to what your parents told you when you got your driver's license, other than be careful. Did they talk to you about the police? I mean, I remember my dad doing that just in a very sort of brief way, telling me if I were to get stopped and he found out I mouthed off to the officer, the ticket was going to be the least of my worries. But that was kind of it. For Black parents, they've grown up in a different country. Their world is different, and they know they cannot depend on a police stop of their young offspring going well. So they have something with them called the talk. This is how you deal with a police stop. Not if, but when it is going to happen to you. And these are survival instructions. This is how you keep your hands. You never say anything unless spoken to. You never, ever talk back. You don't move unless you first tell the officer what you're doing. You're reaching for the glove box. Can I get the registration out of the glove box? Before you do it. Survival skills. Want to have your heart broken? Look at this very quick video. It's called Dear Child. I'm not going to play it here. It's about 4 minutes long, but you can look it up. Dear Child. So, a different world for Black people. These are the causes of these things over and over. Let me return to the story just extremely briefly. I said that if Jordan was going to get justice, it would have to come in a civil trial. And eventually that civil trial happened at this courthouse, which I'm sure you have driven past, downtown Pittsburgh on Grant Street and 7th. There it is. That's our federal courthouse. And there they went to trial, and there was a jury and a judge. And here the question isn't, is somebody guilty of a crime? It's whether Jordan could prove with a preponderance of the evidence, with 51% or more of the evidence, that the police officers had abused process, had done a false arrest, or had used excessive force. 3 charges, right? Now, you've all seen enough TV to know that there's something called giving your own evidence through direct examination, and then there's cross-examination. And Jordan was cross-examined just like all the other witnesses, just like you'd expect. And one of the most common cross-examination techniques is to challenge the witnesses' credibility, their believability, to tell the jury they should not believe the witness. Nothing wrong with that. And Jordan and his lawyers had to know he would be challenged the same way. And he was. Of course he was. First, the cross-examination from the police officers challenged him on actually being an honor roll student. Well, he was on the honor roll, but did that make him an honors student? Like for his whole high school? I'm not kidding. This was the first level of challenges. Second, they challenged him on his injuries. They implied that he was exaggerating his injuries, that he wasn't injured as badly as the medical evidence seemed to imply or that he was implying. But most importantly, they challenged him because he was just an outright liar about what happened to him that night. Why? Because he had to have known that those 3 officers, that those 3 men he saw were police officers. I mean, they got out of the car yelling at the top of their lungs, "Pittsburgh police, don't get up." They had their badges around their necks on cords. You knew, the lawyer said to him. Well, Jordan had always denied that happened, and he denied it in court too. But the lawyer wasn't done. He said, "Oh, of course you knew. Even if even if we could assume that didn't happen, of course you knew. Those 3 men, they were all white. I mean, what would white people be doing in Homewood? Except enforcing the law against Black people. Except for tracking down all the black people with guns and drugs. They were white. Of course you would know they were cops. And just like that, with almost no reaction from anybody sitting there, race was in the courtroom. End of the trial, the jury came back with a partial verdict. They gave the verdict on abusive process to the police. The other two charges, really the main event, false arrest and excessive force, hung jury. So they went back for another trial. The same cross-examination. You had to know they're white. And this time, verdicts. On false arrest, verdict for Jordan, damages awarded. On excessive force, verdict for the police. They did not use excessive force. People did not know what to make of this. The lawyers were puzzled. The judge was puzzled. The media was plenty puzzled. There was only one person who could really salvage something out of this, and that was Jordan himself, who put out a statement through his family a day or two later where he basically said, I'll paraphrase, all I ever wanted was for somebody in charge, somebody official, to say that what happened to me was wrong. And I think I got that. But it wasn't over, because the lawyers for the three police officers contested the verdict. They wanted it overturned. They wanted the judge to reduce the damages to almost zero. And the lawyers for Jordan, they wanted a third trial. Well, finally, the city, independent of all this, settled with Jordan for almost the exact amount that he would have gotten from the jury anyway. And it was done. It took 6.5 years. The city is still divided over Jordan Miles' case. And if you don't believe me, ask somebody who's lived here a while who's African American. This is one of the names that you come to when they talk about Jerry Jackson, Johnny Gamage, Leon Ford, and Jordan Miles. The city is still divided. So if that's what happened, and fear and race are driving this, what is to be done? Let me take my last few minutes with you and give you some ideas. These are things that either I have participated in or others have. They have all been tried. These are real ideas. These can make a difference. Number one, we have to move away from warrior policing. That's got to go. And we must instead have Gaurdian style policing. What is that? It is policing that is not talking about policing as a war. Right? In war, you have casualties. In war, you have collateral damage. It's all acceptable. Right? Gaurdian policing aims to secure everybody, make the city safe for everyone, where police officers look at their job as serving each individual to make them safe and guarantee public order. It's not necessarily catching bad guys at the top of the list. It's to make things safe from everybody. How does it look? It looks like what you see in the task force on 21st century policing, commissioned by President Obama in 2015. The ideas are all there. It's being done. Here's a little piece from a Wall Street Journal article that came about just in July. People, I guess, have asked this so much that they wanted somebody to lay out what this was really like. And this person said, a warrior police officer or police department, they choose their own side and circle the wagons. Guardians choose the side of the law and the community. Warriors dehumanize the enemy. That's how soldiers learn to kill in war. Guardian police officers see people as individuals and serve them accordingly. Warriors survive by instantaneous reaction. There's that, righteous violence thing. Guardians slow down, they think, they ask, they even doubt their own perceptions so that they can get it right and de-escalate. What else? We have to change use of force law. The current use of force law was set by the Supreme Court in the 1980s. It's all based on the standard of an objectively reasonable police officer. Courts and juries are told, view the whole situation through the eyes of a police officer. Not even this one, but an objectively reasonable police officer. Instead, we have to change those standards. Those standards have been enacted into Pennsylvania law, and it must change. And it can change at either the state level or even the local level. City of Pittsburgh is perfectly able to change its use of force law for its police department. This is Governor Newsom in California signing a state law in 2019 that changed their use of force law. It's also been changed in the District of Columbia, and there's a proposal to change the use of force law here in Pennsylvania that came from Representative Summer Lee from right here in our county, which unfortunately has been sitting in some drawer in the state house, not getting even a hearing. This has to change. And if it won't change at the local level, at the state level, it can change at the local level. Cities can change their own laws. Police departments can change their own policies on the use of force. Transparency and accountability are fundamental to the public's understanding of what goes on in a police department. And for too long, police departments have not been transparent, and therefore they are not accountable. Now, I use the Chicago Police Department here as the example because they have one of the worst records on both misconduct against the public and transparency of any police department in the country. But even they have been forced to open up. This man on the right side of the screen, his name is Jamie Calvin. He's a journalist and somewhat of a human rights activist. He went through court to federal court for 6-7 years, lost his case, went to state court, and after another 6-7 years, won his case. And now every officer disciplinary record in Illinois is public. He's not alone. New York State changed its law to make all misconduct records public records in June. And in 2019, California did the same with a new law. This must change. It is regulated here on the level of state law. So this is something we can't change locally unless the state will move on it. This could not be more important. If you don't have the information as a citizen, you can't do anything about this. Insist on it. Insist. Let me put up something local here. Here is Commander Jason Lando. I bet some of you have probably met him. He was the commander of Zone 5 well after the incident involving Jordan Miles, and Zone 5 includes Homewood. And when he was the commander of Zone 5, he started a program. The picture of this program is on the right side of the screen. It's cops and teens from the area. They get together for the day. Cops feed them because that's what you do with teenagers, right? And they spend the day together. They get to know each other. They do role plays where they switch roles. They interview each other. At the end of the day, they actually know each other. It was very successful. I would like to have seen it scaled up to go citywide. It's something that can be done. And I often wondered if Jordan had been in a program like that and those officers knew who he was, and he walked by and one of them said, "Oh, that's that viola kid. He plays a violin, whatever that thing is called. He's all right. Let him, maybe this wouldn't have happened." Next, decriminalize. And I don't just mean this. Okay, that may be coming anyway. But what I'm saying here is there's a lot of things in this country and in this state that do not need to be criminal offenses. How about loose, untaxed cigarettes being sold on a sidewalk? Why do we need the police to respond to that? Right? And of course, you see the terrible image here of Eric Garner dying in a chokehold for the crime of selling loose, untaxed cigarettes and refusing to take any more harassment over it. But even there's more to it than this. What about all the traffic offenses? Now, I don't mean the serious ones like DWI or reckless driving, but these don't all have to be crimes. You can do this with robots and cameras and all kinds of other things. And that takes down the number of police encounters that can go wrong. Other things. Why do we need police to police issues of sleeping in public areas, homelessness, essentially? Why do we need them to be the ones responding to addiction, right? Possession of substances people have for their own addictions. Is that what needs to be a crime? Think about it. Last stop I'd like to make here. Is this what we want? To defund the police? Now, this gets a lot of talk these days. Not all of it is to the good, right? What you see here in the image on the right side of the screen, these are 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council who, days after George Floyd's death, stood up in public and said, we are voting to defund the Minneapolis police, to abolish the police department. They didn't really have a plan, but they were going to do it anyway, right? Now, what I have found is that what this means honestly depends on who you ask. Everybody's got a different answer, right? Does it literally mean no more police? Or does it mean a big change in priorities, right? What I have found is that it depends on who you ask. And even with some of these people standing right up there on that stage in that photo, they're saying different things now. I meant it in spirit, or I sort of feel it was up for interpretation. Others saying, yeah, I don't think that was quite the right thing to do. But can we reimagine the police, not defund them? Can we think not in terms of abolition, but changing priorities, changing budgets? Could you imagine having no police at all? Well, maybe I can't. Look at me. But if I was black and when I called the police to respond when my car got stolen and I ended up in handcuffs, maybe I could, because I live in a different country, remember? So it's possible to have this as a legitimate position. But my experience in Pittsburgh and elsewhere is that more people in black communities don't want their police to be abolished. Sometimes they even want more police, but they want a very different kind of policing. So my take on this is to unbundle the things that police do. Look at it as a bundle of services and ask, to which of these do we want police with handcuffs and guns to respond to, and which of them do we want other service providers to respond to? Ask those questions. Respond to serious crime, sure. But do we want them having to come out for burglar alarms, for mental health crises, for homelessness, for drug addiction? No, we might be better off with other actors, better trained people, specialists to come out for these things. And then the things we actually need police for, they could come for. So, my friends, there's more I could tell you, but I'm already almost 10 minutes over my allotted time, and I do apologize for that. I look forward to the chance to answer your questions, and I'm very honored to have a response coming right now from a great figure in our community and a man I'm happy and honored to call my friend, Reverend Welch. I thank you and everybody who helped arrange this for the opportunity to speak to you tonight.
Thank you very much, Professor Harris, for your beautifully laid out and explicated book, first of all, and for this evening's compelling talk as well. We are so fortunate this evening to have, for our further enrichment, a response from professor, pastor, social justice leader, and engineer, the Reverend Dr. John C. Welch. Reverend Dr. Welch.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be with Professor David Harris, who has been a longtime friend, and it was a very insightful presentation. So I commend you for sharing what you did on tonight, and as well as what you wrote in your book. You know, normally when there's a response to a presentation with scholarly work, much like what Professor Harris did, usually it's a countervailing argument, but I don't have a countervailing argument to give here. I can only give a supportive argument to sort of further cement, I believe, what he presented. Let me first say that, yes, I have been the chaplain for Pittsburgh Police for 10 years, or I was the chaplain over a 10-year period. Chief Nate Harper appointed me in 2008 and I stepped down as heading the chaplaincy at the end of 2018. But policing is a very dangerous profession, but police officers know that when they accept a call to serve and protect the public. It wasn't long after I came on the chaplaincy, began heading it up, that we had the unfortunate tragedy in Stanton Heights in 2009, that Saturday before Palm Sunday. And so I was there in Stanton Heights. I was on the street not long after that incident happened, sea of officers, and they were very stoic. They were stunned, and understandably so. For something like that to have happened to one of their own was certainly shocking. And we all know that it sent shockwaves throughout the city of Pittsburgh, and the tremor still exists today. I'm sure I can say confidently. But the other thing, though, too, is, as we talk about policing in this country, the response sometimes is, well, we just have to get rid of the bad apples. And my response to that is, there's really no such thing as bad apples. What you have is a bad culture. And the culture itself is what allows for or enables actors or bad actors, or who you want to call a bad apple, to be on the streets in our cities and towns. The other problem with whether you're in a corporate setting, whether you're in a nonprofit setting, any sort of organizational setting, and the police departments are organizational settings, is that you can fall prey to groupthink. And it is very thick within police departments, because you want to fall in line. And groupthink is all about conforming and assimilating or acculturating to the dominant culture or dominant narrative. And there is a dominant narrative in policing. And Professor Harris shared that with us. It's this whole warrior mentality that for the most part, in my opinion, was exacerbated or accentuated after the 1994 crime bill. It began earlier with the war on drugs under Ronald Reagan, seeded with Nixon, but really got legs under Ronald Reagan. But then when the crime bill came in 94, it really did not make matters any better. So recognizing that you have to fix the culture within policing if we're going to make any headway. And I'm happy to still say that we had a police chief who was doing that very thing, and that was Chief Cameron McClay. And quite frankly and honestly and transparently, I decided to run for mayor after Chief Cam McClay left the city of Pittsburgh, because I felt that he did not get the support he deserved. He came into reform and he was not supported in his reformation efforts, and because he had to fight the FOP, and he ended up leaving. And some of you may have heard in the news that Commander Jason Lando, is a candidate to be a police chief in Milwaukee, in a city in Wisconsin. I think it's Milwaukee. And where is Cam McClay? Cam McClay is in Wisconsin. So, and it's because of Cam McClay that Jason Lando was promoted to chief or commander in Zone 5. So we had an excellent commander in Cam, and it's unfortunate that he's not still with us leading our police departments. Let me also state that one of the things that I've noticed sort of in this wave of Black Lives Matter is sort of this counter argument, and you've noticed it too, the Blue Lives Matter. So Professor Harris showed the picture of the jerseys that the officers were wearing in support of their brothers and during the Jordan Mounds situation. And it had the thin blue line on the back of the shirts. Well, that thin blue line, that blue line it might be thin looking, but it's very thick. And officers do everything they can to support each other. And I understand why they would do that, because when you have, it's no different than when you're in the military and you're on the battlefield, when your life can potentially be in jeopardy, you want to make sure that your partner has your back. Now, if I sense that my partner does not have my back, then I'm going to question my partner and his or her ability to fend with me and protect me. And so sometimes this leads to misgivings or bad deeds and then cover-ups. So there is a culture in policing that definitely needs to be dismantled. So I want to dismantle the culture. I don't want to defund police. I do want to look at reprioritizing how it's funded, but I want to dismantle the culture that has been pervasive for 400 years, because it started with the policing started with the slave patrols, when freed white indentured servants were let go and given guns and put on the slave patrols to go after runaway slaves and then enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. So, so I want to destroy or dismantle the culture of policing. Another thing which I appreciate Dr. Harris bringing to our attention is this whole idea of race and fear. Let me say that Black people are afraid of the police. There's a difference in prepositions here that I want to point out. Black people are afraid of the police. White people are afraid for the police, because white people live in a different world than Black people do. And so, yes, we've had the talk. I've received the talk. I've given the talk. I was pulled over by Pittsburgh police 4 times, maybe 5, but I'm sure 4 times. And none of those situations were for traffic violations. 3, well, they weren't proven traffic violations. 2 of the times I was pulled over because I was driving a nice Volvo 740 GL in 1989. It's a 1-year-old car. I was working for IBM. I was a successful IT consultant, and I was driving through Homewood, and they pulled me over and said that a car matching my description was reported stolen. A second time I was pulled over right in front of my house in my Suburban SUV with my 4 children in the back and my wife sitting beside me. 3 cars pulled up on me. Again, the story was, well, this car matched the description of a vehicle that was involved in the felonious activities. And so profiling, racial profiling, is something that has been long time rampant within our community. So we're afraid of the police, while many of you are afraid for the police. And so the Blue Lives Matter issue is something that typically comes out in contradistinction to and over and against the Black Lives Matter. And as I said before, the lives of police officers are on the line every single day. But note this statistic as well. More officers are killed in the line of duty by white assailants than they are Black assailants. But the dominant narrative paints Black actors as the ones who are the most predisposed to shooting and killing officers, because we are, quote unquote, innately criminal. But the statistics will show that more officers are killed in the line of duty by white assailants than Black assailants. The other thing too is the way that Professor Harris talked about the tuning of the mind, the seeing Black people, seeing the images of guns. This is something that the Harvard IAT test, a rendition of the Harvard IAT test was used on police officers as well. And the result was that even when they saw the flash of a person who was Black that wasn't holding a gun, they were predisposed to shoot that person. And so this whole idea of implicit bias, which is steeped not only in policing, but it's also steeped in medicine. As a PhD in healthcare ethics, I've studied this as well. And so this is something that saturates our dominant culture, period. It's not just policing. It's in a variety of venues within our society. And healthcare is no different. Recent studies, significant studies have shown that physicians are more inclined, because of bias, to act negatively towards people of color, patients of color, than they are white. So this issue of bias in policing is really important, and bias in our culture, period, is really important. And what I'll say lastly is that it's important for us to recognize the dog whistles, and the whole notion of law and order is dog whistling, because it goes back to the Black codes during the Jim Crow period. It's no different than the slave codes. It's no different than the war on drugs. This whole issue of law and order was the platform that Reagan ran on, is what Trump is bringing back up now, is dog whistles for war on Black people. And the police officers are the ones who are out there enforcing the laws. But if the laws are disproportionately applied to people of color, then you have to question the enforcement. The other thing to bear in mind too is we're talking about police, but the whole judicial system needs to be corrected, because there's judicial tyranny from all the way from the magistrate level to juvenile detention centers, all the way up the ladder. And so we can address what police officers are doing and how they're mistreating and abusing their power, but also we have to question the how people of color are treated in the courtrooms as well. And so I will end my response with that and turn it back over to Francis if there should be any questions. And thank you for the time.
Have to unmute. Thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Welch, and thank you, Professor Harris. We have questions from the attendees. One person has asked, probably to Professor Harris, in terms of policing and which activities probably don't require police. You have talked about using others. This attendee mentioned social workers, de-escalation, trained intervention specialists. Can you say something about how to use other professionals in situations?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. This is something that's getting a lot of attention now, and I think with justification. There are a number of programs in other areas of the country where, for instance, when a person is in a mental health crisis, right now, pretty much anywhere you go, somebody dials 911, the police are going to show up. And what these locations have done, one of them Eugene, Oregon, another Denver, is that they have a system set up where all but the dangerous calls will go to a set of mental health and social work responders. Sometimes they go out in a team with police. Sometimes they go out alone. The one program that has been probably longest running is called CAHOOTS. It's spelled exactly like the word cahoots, and that actually stands for an acronym. It's an acronym for something I can't recall, but that's in Eugene, Oregon. I would really recommend that anybody who's interested in this idea of other professionals responding, take a look at the CAHOOTS program. And you can imagine programs like that for a variety of different kinds of responses. Whether it is having civilians come and take police reports about accidents, having civilians come for calls about burglar alarms, all kinds of things. What you want to do is move those responsibilities that are better suited to other people, people who have training in drug addiction, people who have training in homeless issues. Have those people be the responders with the idea that police can back them up if necessary, because the problem isn't really criminal. This is a more complicated issue than people realize. It takes changing the 911 system. It takes changing. So it isn't simply a matter of saying, okay, these guys do it. Now we're going to take the money from the police. I want everybody to know that this is a big lift and it's complicated, but it's something we should be working toward.
Thank you. This is a question for the Reverend Dr. Welch. In light of your observation that the police department socializes people into groupthink, and that police officers learn necessarily to fall in line with that groupthink, and one attendee has noted that the police union tends to be made up of a majority of people who reinforce the warrior mindset, and that a change in mindset is needed. Can you say something about how we can work on that groupthink mindset?
That's a very good question. We can't look at the police department or police bureaus in the same way as we could look at other organizations, even though groupthink exists across all of the spectrums. The intensity within policing is so great that it really is going to require the work at the top to sort of deal with the whole groupthink mentality or idea, but also in the academy. You want to make sure that when you're working with organizations like the police, if you're a police officer, you want to make sure that you're not an outlier, at least in the eyes of your fellow brothers and sisters. And because, as I mentioned before, your ability to perform may be called into question. There are officers who, and I'm not just speaking of police, I'm speaking across the country. There are officers who will not divulge that they're not well because they don't want to appear weak. And so the last thing an officer wants to do is to appear weak to their fellow officers. And so they give into groupthink because of that. The other thing too, I wanted to mention earlier is, there are departments across the country that, for the sake of beefing up the departments, rather than, and maybe because they can't recruit civilians, they'll bring in people that have military backgrounds and experiences and to bring into the police departments, which I don't necessarily agree with, because as Professor Harris mentioned, this warrior mentality exists not only on the battlefield, but in our streets. And we don't need folks turning our streets into war zones. And so I spoke with one person who was a veteran and who was dealing with PTSD, and just the sounds of gunfire triggers him. And he's not even on the police department. So you have to ask yourself, what kind of officer who was formerly in Iraq or Afghanistan is being triggered by activity that's taking place on the streets? And are they well enough to even serve and protect the public?
If I could add just a moment on that, I think this is the question, and I think Reverend Welch raised the culture question, and these two things go together. I believe that this is the central and heaviest lift there is to change the culture. I do see some willingness to do it for the first time. There's a program in New Orleans in their police department called EPIC, Ethical Policing is Courageous. A similar program is just starting up in the Chicago Police Department. And the idea is to make it part of the culture to go to your fellow officer and say, hey, don't do that. Don't use too much force. Intervene when somebody is making a mistake that's going to cost a civilian injury or life and might cost a police officer a career. These things are hard to do, and we have to recognize that moving the culture will never be easy, but if we don't do it, the rest of what we have in mind may not ever succeed, because one of the comments that went across the screen is right. It's not about the bad apples, it's the barrel, right? The barrel is bad, the culture is bad.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A follow-up question came through for Reverend Dr. Welch. Again, about the military and warrior culture. One of the people here this evening asked, does the military and warrior culture connect to the unusually high incidence of suicide among police?
Another great question, and the answer to that is yes. One of the things that has also been studied and documented is that whenever there are line of duty deaths, typically suicides will follow. And we saw suicides we didn't see it, but there were some Pittsburgh police officers that did commit suicide not long after the 2009 situation here in Pittsburgh. But suicide among officers is certainly a reality. And that points to the lack of mental health support that officers don't get and they need. There's a book by a guy named Kevin Gilmartin. I was made aware of him through the U.S. U.S. Pretrial and Probation's office. They brought him in to speak to officers from all of the various departments across Western Pennsylvania. And he's a former deputy sheriff out in Arizona, but he's a psychologist, and he wrote a book called Emotional Survival of Law Enforcement. And so he recognizes the psychology of policing, and the psychology of policing has the negative effect of bleeding into every avenue that police officer may reside, home, other areas. And so police officers tend to become alcoholics. Police officers tend to become addicted to drugs. Police officers have a tendency of being abusive to their spouses because they have this mentality that they're hyper vigilant and they can't break this situation. And so you talk to any officer, not any, but most officers, if they go to a public place, they will not sit with their back to the wall. or back to the door. They have to see the door at all times. And the unfortunate thing, though, is you may remember the story where these officers in Las Vegas were ambushed at a pizza place. They weren't looking at the door. And it just so happened that I was vacationing in Vegas the very week that it happened. And so the whole notion of hypervigilance is something that runs rampant within police officers because of their training, but you also have the same thing with military personnel as well. So without the proper mental health supports, you're going to have officer suicides taking place.
Thank you. Thank you. I do have the sense that as chaplain to the police, you probably know more about this than the rest of us do, the vulnerabilities. We have a comment from someone that says military police, actual military police, tend not to shoot soldiers they need to arrest. So somewhere there's a disconnect. We're training these warrior culture police when the actual military police are perhaps a little better.
Well, this is interesting because I've been reading some about the military justice system for some other work, and what you have is a very different approach during accusations of criminal conduct and trials. The other person on the who is charged, we would call them the defendant in the civilian system. That person isn't demonized the same way in the military justice system. Why? Because we all know, as we're sitting up there in judgment, that that person has done something good. That person is part of the same organization, has volunteered to be a soldier. Right? And it's the same thing that would keep military police from shooting other soldiers. They actually have a common bond, right? So it's a fundamentally different context than when you send police out in a warrior mindset to patrol Homewood, right? The Homewood is the battle space, and the people outside that car away from your partners, they're not in the same context as you.
They're not one of us.
Too much us and them, yes.
We have another person who asked, can we get some small, specific steps that we can take towards making this situation better?
I'd say there are a lot of small, specific steps you can take, but the most important one is to be vocal and be active in your local government. Too often people are looking up and they're saying, well, what is the president doing? And what is Mitch McConnell doing? And, well, okay, Nancy Pelosi in the House passed this bill, but it'll never pass the Senate. Don't look up there. Look down here, because the Pittsburgh City Council has actually taken some steps on some of these police issues. The Pittsburgh City Council has outlawed chokeholds and neck restraints. The Pittsburgh City Council has said there shall be a policy within the police department that officers will intervene when they see other officers committing misconduct. You may like these policies, you may not, but the point is policing is controlled locally, right? You can have the greatest impact by getting active locally and also on the state level. I pointed to a number of things on the state level in my remarks, but that's the way into all of these things, is to act locally and pressure the people who are in power, who you can actually get to. As far as what those steps can be, a local police department or city council can change any policy within the police department that you think is wrong, whether it's high-speed chases, whether it's foot chases, whether it's the warrior training that you don't want people in your police department to take anymore. You can act on that collectively and locally.
You know, they say politics is local. And, you know, I would add to what Professor Harris said too, is, you know, we could push for better recruiting within the police officers. You know, back in 1997, Pittsburgh was put under federal consent decree. And that was 2 years after the Johnny Gamage incident and 2 years after the Jerry Jackson incident. And as a result of the federal consent decree, Pittsburgh had more women on the police force in any city in the United States, but also there was a balance of African Americans on the force as well. But as the consent decree faded away, Pittsburgh police went back to their hiring practices, and there were some other nefarious activities going on as well that led to qualified people of color being shut out from the hiring process, for which the city of Pittsburgh was sued. And so, but making sure that we have better recruiting is something that we could work on as well on a local level. So he's right. Think locally for sure.
Thank you. We have a follow-up for both of you. Someone asked, how does fragmentation of police departments within the county impact the ability to make these changes?
Oh, it's a terrifically difficult problem. And it's not just in policing either. It is across many different kinds of services, everything from schools, I mean, you name it. But with policing, it's very bad. You know, I remember getting calls in the wake of the terrible incident in Ferguson, Missouri back in 2014 or 15 from journalists or other people saying, you won't believe it, St. Louis County has 50 police departments. It's unimaginable. How can we have control over how can we change things when there are 50? I said, pal, I got you there. We're well over 100. Right? We have Pittsburgh, of course. We have the Allegheny County Police. We have the Sheriff's Police. We have Pitt Police. That's a pretty big one too. But we have over 100 of these, some very small police departments. And it's important to understand that the problems we have on the ground in Pittsburgh they don't stop at the city limits. You have all kinds of the same problems in many of these places, and they're not equipped and not well funded enough to have the kind of police departments that they want. And they've got people working basically for, $12.50 an hour, multiple shifts. They go and they change into the uniform of another police department and go on shift again. This is a terribly difficult problem, yet lots of these smaller governments do not want to give up having their own local police. This is a fundamental problem for our whole region across a number of different municipal issues. And it will take more than just the city of Pittsburgh to improve everything for people in Allegheny County.
Yeah, just recently, I think Braddock, Rankin, East Pittsburgh, and a fourth municipality is looking at regionalizing their police departments. And so, this whole regionalism issue is something that is definitely has prevented prosperity in Allegheny County for much of Allegheny County's history because of this sectarianism and, the fragmentation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Here's a question from an attendee who articulates the model cities of Camden, New Jersey, and I've lost it, who have reformed their police departments. And other cities don't necessarily know about that. And this person is asking about media coverage, perhaps how things like this could be publicized so that there can be a seed of change that helps propagate it. Do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I'm well aware of the situation in Camden, New Jersey. There has been a lot of writing about that, especially in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Camden, New Jersey was a very poor town, a lot of industry left, a lot of crime, and a very troubled police department. And because of a very rare confluence of political and social factors, the police department's running out of money. I mean, they were cutting their, you talk about defunding, they were just being defunded because there was no money. So they were shrinking that way. And then you had this group of political actors. Chris Christie was still the governor. There was this very powerful Democratic politician, and then there was a third actor in the mix who I don't remember. And what they decided to do, along with the local people, was to simply blow up the police department they have, to stop it, gut it, and start over. Not every place can do that. Not every time will you have this sort of lightning striking three times to do it. But what they've come up with in its place is a county-based police department that is all based on community policing. right? So they've redone it from the bottom up. It had the consequence of the union no longer being in the picture. I think the union was looked upon, and probably rightly so, as a real obstruction to change and reform. So there's no union anymore, and many of the same officers got jobs back, but not the core people in the union who had sort of stood in the way of change. And now you have not a perfect police department, but a much better one, much better, not just on crime control metrics, but on community involvement and so forth. And so when the marches were in Camden this spring and summer, like they were here in Pittsburgh, police were part of it. The chief marched in the Black Lives Matter parade. Protest. So it has changed things very fundamentally. And if anybody is really interested in what happened in Camden, I think the best piece I saw written on that was written for Politico, and I can send somebody the link if they want to reach out.
Yes, please do send it, and then people can get in touch with us to share. Another question that was asked, particularly in line with changing roles with non-armed police officers for things that don't require non-armed police officers. One attendee pointed out that it can be dangerous for social workers and non-officers to go into certain situations. I wonder, perhaps both of you could comment on that.
Sure. I mean, there is specialized training that would go beyond just your social worker training that you would need to be in these situations. And like I said, some cities that have done this haven't gone full bore only social workers. They sort of have a partner model where a police officer goes out just to make sure that they are not needed. And then if not needed, they leave. I heard several interviews with the folks from that Cahoots program. And it's ongoing for 30 years, and they were actually having trouble coming up with a number of times where they've actually needed police assistance or protection over those 30 years. Less than a dozen, I think, was the guess that they gave. So I don't think it would be as common as people think, but there would be some times when they might need a police officer with them, and so that has to be built into the system so there can be an appropriate response.
You know, one of the trainings that nationwide training, and we were doing this here in Pittsburgh, is crisis intervention training. So officers are trained, CIT trained, to go in to de-escalate situations, particularly when the person or the actor has a mental illness. And not enough police departments allow for their officers to have that training. So if you have a CIT trained officer accompanying a social worker, or even a paramedic, what have you, that can go to de-escalating a situation quite effectively. And so one, making sure the officers are CIT trained, and two, and if we're going to deploy social workers where I think is appropriate, as Professor Harris said, not every situation requires an officer to go in and to look for a crime being committed. But sometimes it just needs effective de-escalation, and having the right personnel there, a CIT trained officer and perhaps a social worker, could probably go a long way.
Mm-hmm. CIT training, it would be part of the answer to how to train officers in something other than being a warrior, being a helper. And a question was asked how for example, the city of Pittsburgh, but how a police department could be forced or could be required to do something different with the training, such as requiring more or allowing more CIT training. How can they be moved in that direction?
This is local political action again. Right? If this is what you want, citizens of Pittsburgh, demand it from the city council, knowing that they are going to say, okay, that doesn't mean defund, you want more funds. CIT training is 40 hours long. That means you have to take somebody off the board for 40 hours, still pay them, right? Mm-hmm. And if you actually want everybody trained in CIT, which is a very good training for dealing with people with mental illness, you can do that, but you have to, A, insist on it, B, be prepared to pay for it. Mm-hmm. That either means more tax dollars going into policing or shifting away dollars from something else. There's no getting around it.
Mhm. Thank you. We were a couple of different questions asked things about the police accountability boards. Commented that the police accountability boards here in Pittsburgh do not have real power, and how can we get more power to that segment? I'd like both of you to speak to that.
Sure. The Citizens Police Review Board here has been in existence since about the time of the consent decree that Reverend Welch referenced back in 1997. It was created democratically by the voters of Pittsburgh. And it's actually on the ballot again right now. So if you're a voter, vote to increase the power that they have. That will help them some. I would disagree with the questioner this far. It is not the fact that they don't have any power. They do have power. They are actually as well outfitted with the powers needed for their office as any citizens police board in the country. They have subpoena power. They have an independent board. They have an independently guarded budget, all kinds of other things. What they don't have, and no civilian oversight operation has, is the power to impose discipline. That is left to the chief. And you may think that's appropriate. You may not. In Pittsburgh, if the Citizens Police Review Board says, we recommend this, the chief, if the chief isn't going to do it, has to write a kind of explanation for why they're not going to do it. We know that the Citizens Police Review Board here has been fought up until the current administration was fought tooth and nail by basically every administration before that, city government and police. They now have somewhat better relationship going on. And if we support them and understand what they do, we want the police chief to be able to impose discipline. We don't want civilians to do that. And then we want to be able to hold the police chief accountable for those decisions through holding the mayor accountable. That's how we have to act in a situation like this.
Thanks. Reverend Welch, do you want to add something?
Yeah, you know, right now the Citizens Police Review Board in Pittsburgh is a one-sided level of accountability, because the argument is the FOP never really endorsed it, and so you have this tension between the Citizens Police Review Board and the FOP, or you have the FOP against the world for the matter. I don't even call them a union anymore. They are a fraternal order. They're off to themselves. But we also know that Allegheny County was pushing to have its own Citizens Review Board. But understand, the County Citizen Review Board will only be effective on the county police and I believe the sheriff. So they would have no power over Wilkinsburg, no power over Clarendon, no power over any of the other 100+ municipalities that have police departments. And so every municipality, for the most part, would have to have their own review board, unless I believe there's some change to state law, and Professor Harris could better elucidate that. But it's nice to have the county review board, but understand the limits of its power.
Yeah, that's correct. If the county creates a review board now under state law, it cannot obligate any of these other municipalities to opt in. It can offer them things that would tempt them to opt in, but it can't make them. That will take a change in state law.
Here's another question. Do police officers have continuing education requirements like other professionals, like lawyers and medical professionals?
They have to be retrained periodically in certain of their skills, but I don't know much more than that. I mean, they have to have a certain number of hours on the shooting range and some other things. John, do you know more?
I don't. I was just thinking that they have to go through some MOPEC recertification, I believe, periodically, but that's is related to their skills. Shooting, you have to be able to shoot straight. Still have to be able to see. But I don't think there's any continuing education, much like the other professions you mentioned.
I like that question. This question will be for Reverend Welch, and it's a sort of a thought that an attendee said. How does a warrior let go, unlearn, reshape into a guardian? Let's hear from our pastor. thoughts on that? It's not an easy one. Came from a pastor, by the way.
It's not, but it's interesting that that question was raised, because there are some departments across the country that are actually implementing mindfulness techniques that they're making their officers go through because of the whole vigilance that I mentioned earlier. But also, I think to sort of deconstruct the whole warrior mindset, at least to allow for officers to at least enter a situation more centered. Yes, of course, their lives are on the line, but looking at bringing in these Eastern practices of mindfulness into the curriculum, into the body of work of policing, is something I think would be a good positive step forward to sort of break down the whole warrior mentality. But it's going to take a lot more than that. But I would, and of course, I have to say, using your police chaplains as a support would also be helpful. It took 10 years for us to really make some headways with Pittsburgh police officers. One of the first things I did was to sort of establish credibility was I found ministers who had police training who were former officers. And if they weren't former officers, they had to go through the Citizens Police Academy. They had to go through CIT training. They had to go through CISM training, which is critical crisis intervention, stress management training. Anything to sort of reduce the barriers to sort of create trust and be able to facilitate relationship building with police officers. But building that trust is really difficult between chaplains and police, because police, they put up a strong wall, and it's pretty much is very impenetrable. And so unless you wear a blue uniform and carry a gun, they're not really going to share much with you. And so, so for them to be able to use the supports and rely on the supports that they have through the chaplains, I think is one other thing that they could do.
Yes. We don't have other questions. And I'd like to thank Professor Harris and Reverend Welch for these wonderful, wonderful comments and thoughts, and for sharing the extensive background that you both have. And thank all of the attendees for your time, for your attention, and for your thoughtful questions. What I would like to do is turn things over for our closing prayer to Rabbi Ron Simons, who is Senior Director of Jewish Life at the JCC of Greater Pittsburgh. And Rabbi Simons will dismiss us with a prayer. Rabbi Simons?
Thank you, Francis. And to you, David and John, thank you for your expertise, for your passion, and for being willing to share it with us in such articulate and passionate ways. So friends, let us pray. Eloheinu Elohei Dorotenu, our God and God of our generations, the God of generations that came before us, the God of this generation, and perhaps most importantly, the God of the generations yet to come. As we began our evening with words of scripture quoted by Reverend Liddy Barlow, justice, justice shall you pursue. Let us understand that you can't just try it once, and maybe even twice isn't enough. We need to keep on fighting for justice. And in our daily lives, the small acts that we need to do, as Micah said, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. But perhaps most importantly, we can turn to the words of Isaiah, who says, your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. May each one of us walk away from this evening feeling more empowered as guardians of those foundations that need to be rebuilt, knowing that each one of us is in fact a repairer of brokenness for our city. As together we say, Amen.